Episode 8 of Mets Off Day Live. I'm your host, Michelle Margaux, and joining us today are Tim Britton of The Athletic and Dave Lennon of Newsday. We're going to talk all things Mets over the next half hour, and we'll take some fan questions live as they come in, so put them in the chat wherever you are watching. But first, welcome to the show, Tim and Dave.
Thanks for having me.
Great to see you guys. So before we get into the Mets series against the Astros, we always revisit the last off day. So here's how some of the Mets spent their last off day, and I'm going to ask which one of them sound the nicest to you guys. So Eduardo Escobar played dominoes with his family. Starling Marte had a dessert spread complete with chocolate cake and fried Oreos. And yes, that also surprises me given his outfit at the All-Star game last year, the fact that he can eat those. And then Mark Canha, of course, went to Lord's Restaurant and had curried lamb scotch eggs, which is a meal that is too elite for my palate. I don't even know what that is. And then Jeff McNeil hosted his first Drive for Good event at Topgolf in support of Metropolitan PGA. So he wins for most philanthropic off day. Tim, which one sounds nicest to you?
I mean, I think you had me at dessert spread with Starling Marte. Canha's meal, I've had curry, I've had lamb, I've had scotch, I've had eggs. I've never had it all together as one dish. But yeah, dessert platter, fried Oreos. The reason to go to any state fair is fried Oreos. So I'm good with that.
Fair. Dave, what about you?
Easy choice for me. I'm a golf guy, so I would have joined McNeil at Topgolf. I could have spent, I don't know how many hours he was there. I could have spent 22, 23 hours of my off day hitting golf balls there. So yeah, that's a slam dunk for me. And I'm with Tim. I mean, I like, fancy food as much as the next guy, but that lamb scotch egg apparatus, that's a tough one to sign on for.
I completely agree with both of you guys. All right, so it's been about a week, actually exactly a week since our last off day and since our last show. The Mets won their first game against St. Louis and then dropped the next two. And then they did the same thing in Houston. They won the first game and then dropped the next two. So they now have 40 losses on the season. They didn't get their 40th loss last season until August 12th. So, Dave, what do you take out of the last two series for the Mets?
Ooh, man, do we have enough time? I mean, how long is this show for? I mean, it seems like every night they play, there's about 3 hours worth of things to unpack. But I mean, I just think it's the inconsistency, Michelle. I mean, I know that it's been a common theme here, but every time we're on the verge of talking about a turnaround here or a 7-inning start that sparks them on their way, the following day just kind of lands with a thud. And I think as we move from series to series, I mean, the Cardinals, I like how we bill all these series as another chance to get well against a bad team. Lo and behold, the Mets are looking around the room and figuring out that, they're a bad team too right now. And I think that's what we learned about the Cardinals series. Just a weekend full of frustration for them. Or again, whether it's shooting themselves in the foot, whether it's just being, inadequate in just too many areas of the game, whether it's defensively, whether it's pitching, whether it's the offensive end. So, again, and the frustration carried through to Houston. I mean, that was a situation where they had a chance to win that series against, the defending champs. And then that last game last night yesterday afternoon was tough to explain. I mean, one of the crazier games of the year. And again, the Mets are playing too many times this year, and the phrase, just good enough to lose. And I think that's why their record is where it is right now. And I think these past two series were pretty good examples of that.
Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at the last 6 games, really the month of June, and the thing that has stood out is the sloppiness that the Mets have displayed. That's not something we saw really at all last season. And even when they struggled in May, it wasn't so much, they weren't making the kind of fielding errors, base running mishaps that they have in the month of June. And it's something that's so uncharacteristic for what we talk about as a Buck Showalter team. And we gave them a lot of credit for not doing those things last year. They exploited when other teams made those mistakes last year. They were so good against teams like the Phillies, who didn't field very well. And this year, they're playing more like that team. That series against the Yankees, even going back to last week, I was really struck by how sloppy both teams were. And they seem to both kind of be giving games away. And the Mets have done that far too often, especially this month, as their record has plummeted.
We're definitely going to get into that a little bit later in the show, but let's stick with some positives here. Some have found some success in recent days. So Daniel Vogelbach had his share of struggles leading up to that 1 week mental break that he took. seems to be moving in the right direction. So Buck, like I said, give him that mental break. And then in his 5 games back from that break, has hit 2 home runs and driven in 7 runs. So Tim, what do you see that's different out of Daniel Vogelbach since that break?
He's getting the ball in the air. I mean, that's what he said he was working on. His ground ball rate had really jumped this year. I think for his career, it's under 40%. For this season, it's over 50%. Daniel Vogelbach is not Willie Mays Hayes. You do not want him hitting the ball on the ground and beating it out to first base. You want him lifting the ball in the air, and he's done that this past week. I think he himself said, that first game back against St. Louis, it wasn't just the home run that he hit that night. It was another deep fly ball that he hit that he felt really good about where his swing path was. He's got to get the ball in the air for line drives and fly balls. That's where he's going to have his most impact.
Dave, do you think that kind of success is sustainable for the rest of the season for Daniel?
Well, I'll just rewind a little bit with how just unorthodox and unusual it was for him to get that mental break while remaining on the active roster, to have a team that was struggling as they were play shorthanded, during that point, especially for in that DH spot. So that was extremely unusual. And I'll say this, if this turnaround didn't happen after that mental break, I don't know where they were going with Daniel Vogelbach, but maybe it happens it's a long season, and, we've been on Daniel Vogelbach a lot for his inadequacies in the DH spot. Sometimes, that time away can help. You don't realize what you're doing wrong when you're in the grind every single day. And when you step away from it and take a more macro view of things and maybe get a chance to adjust, as Tim mentioned, just the simple fact of just getting the ball in the air more. I think that can make a big difference. And I think that's what's been reflected here. So listen, is Daniel Vogelbach Barry Bonds and is going to, continue to stretch for the course of the next 2.5 months, 3 months? That's going to be a stretch. I think you're still going to see some ups and downs with him for sure. But, the Mets can't get greedy. They're living one day at a time right here. And every day they can have with Daniel Vogelbach, that's a good day, as he had yesterday too, which was a good breakout day for him. Then they'll take it. And again, so much of the game is confidence. And if he can get some of that positive momentum, especially away from City, which has been a pretty difficult place for him to play based on how unfriendly that can be to the home players when they're struggling. So I think whatever momentum he can build on, going to a park like Citizens Bank Park, this weekend too, I think it can be, like you mentioned, it can be a positive step for him.
I just think it's funny that you reference Willie Mays Hayes and you reference Barry Bonds. It seems a little unfair to put them all in the same sentence. So let's talk about Francisco Lindor on the other hand, also finding some success. So he cuts his hair, then he celebrates the birth of his second child, and then on Father's Day hits a home run and then hits another home run the day after that on Monday. So Tim, do you think that this is a turning point for Lindor in terms of just his consistency at the plate?
You sure hope so. I know he hopes so. It is a compelling narrative to say that it's not just cutting the hair, it's the birth of his second child. I know Francisco was pretty candid back in 2021, at least after the fact, about how much, the trade, making the change in teams to New York, but also the birth of his first child. I think the phrase he kept using was it was difficult to get his arms all around everything at that time. And he was pretty open this year that, he was thinking a lot about his wife going through that pregnancy. I think most parents would tell you that the final weeks of a pregnancy are not the most fun part of your life. And so hopefully from the Mets perspective, that having that stress reduced a little bit frees up his mind a little bit. He's a better hitter than he has shown clearly. It was kind of a weird season and it started trending in a negative direction for him in May. You hope that he's been able to find something against right-handed pitching in particular, because that's where the struggles have really been pronounced. He's always been a relatively even switch hitter. So you hope that this is his response against righties and he's able to carry that going into the next month.
Yeah, Dave, how do you evaluate his offensive production as a whole this season? I mean, he has the elevated RBIs, but the batting average is low.
Well, I mean, if you could, first of all, I just wanted to say that, if this Lindor keeps this up, you're going to see a lot more June birthdays for players, kids, being a trendsetter there. But, I think the problem with Lindor, and we've seen, and this is kind of an extreme example that's going on this year, is getting in love with the power side to his game, and, we saw that in Cleveland where he kind of had that one breakout year, where all of a sudden, with the juice ball, he was starting to think he was that kind of guy. That could just hit, 30 home runs or whatever it is. So I think he kind of falls in love with that sometimes. I think you see kind of his swing path in the beginning part of the season, just always going for the power aspect and the launch angle here. And that's why you saw, his strikeout numbers were through the roof. And I think that's problematic for him. he's too athletic of a player to just live like that. I mean, he can run, and putting the ball in play is, it is his friend. So I don't know how you get him out of that. God knows we've talked to him, about the strikeout numbers and why the other numbers have been as low. I mean, the numbers are up now. I mean, he was at one point, I think he was hitting like 212 with an on-base percentage below 300. I mean, those are incredible numbers, for a player of his stature. Salary aside, I mean, $341 million, we'll even take that off the table. But for a guy of his ability, and again, multi-dimensional ability, not just, gap home run ability, those numbers were wild. And I think maybe now, again, his salvation here is the home runs and the RBI total, which has kind of put him more, an elite class for those numbers. But man, you have to see those other slash marks, come up for him, because they're just not representative of a guy that the Mets have, hitting in the, top three of their lineup or so. So we'll see which way those go. I'm pessimistic on that. I think he likes the home runs and RBIs, so I don't really think he's going to feel too necessary to change, but I guess we'll see.
Well, either way, we're trending in the right direction offensively.
Yes.
It does seem like maybe one step forward, two steps back with Mets starting pitching. They have been a thorn in the team's side all season. For context, the team has scored 7 or more runs 7 times in the last 22 games, and they've lost 6 of those games. So we're going to start with Verlander and Scherzer. With Max, the team's 8-4. With Justin Verlander, the team is 3-6. So Tim, after that Yankees start and then the 8-inning start in Houston, do you think that Max has refound his slider?
He did for one night, and the slider against the Yankees was as bad as we've seen it with him. He was hanging pretty much every slider. And he said, his explanation was he had made a switch with his changeup. He tried to carry it over to his slider, and it did not work. And that he just kind of ditched the switch with his changeup and went back to his old slider. But the slider had been an issue even before the Yankees start, not to the same extent it was that night. But this is a pitch he did not allow a single home run on last year. He's allowed 5 home runs on his slider this year. He's never allowed more than 6 home runs on his slider, his bread and butter breaking ball in his career. So I think you need to see more than one start with both of these guys. The problem isn't just they haven't flashed one good start. It's that they haven't been able to carry that over from one start to the next 5 days later. We've been talking about with Scherzer trying to find his rhythm and his timing and getting into a normal routine. It's June 22nd, and we're still talking about that. We need to see him put together 3 or 4 good starts, relying on that slider before we say anything is fixed here.
Yeah, it is so interesting. And it seems like it's really been the case with most of the starters. They have a good week and then they don't have a good week. And then they have a good start and then they don't have a good start. And there's really, no one's stringing together, 5 good starts in a row and then having a bad stretch. It really is, opposite. But one thing about Verlander, Dave, is that he has been able to adapt his entire career, right? Like no matter what, he's been able to keep up with the times. Why do you think that he has not found that consistent success here in New York yet?
Well, I mean, we always kind of poo-poo the, changing things in your life and changing routines and all that. And as you get older, it certainly becomes more difficult to do that. And listen, he just turned 40, that's a real number for a professional athlete. I mean, that's not just like, not everybody is Tom Brady in that regard and can play till you're 45 or whatever and can play at a high level. So I'm not saying age is the reason for all this, but there is a lot going on here. I mean, I know we always point to that he won the Cy Young last year, and he did, and he was great, for a world champion team. Uprooting that, turning 40, coming over here to a new team, to a team that, had such high expectations, but maybe wasn't outfitted to deliver in those necessarily. And, getting injured on opening day, with the shoulder strain that he had. So that threw him off. And we talk about pitchers, needing that routine and needing the development into a season. And that really got him off in a bad way. And yes, he's a very established veteran. He's a future Hall of Famer. He's a 3-time Cy Young Award winner. He's also human. And there are parts to that are real. And this is not to make excuses for it, but we're seeing it play out on the field. These are not just things we're making up here. Lack of consistency, points to those things. So, unless there is something that he's nursing as an injury, you never know. With Scherzer, it seems things with him always come up from time to time that affect him. It really hasn't seemed to play a part with Verlander. But as these guys get older, there are some injuries you hear about. There are some injuries you don't. There are some things that are pitching with that maybe affect them as mechanically that they don't even want to talk about because they don't want to, disclose too much. So in Verlander's case, I don't know what else you could say about it because it's very difficult, to go from winning the Cy Young one year, especially at his multiple Cy Young winner, and then struggle like he has. 4.5 ERA. There have been a couple nights where he was non-competitive against in Atlanta, for instance. That's not Justin Verlander. So the other night, if the Mets offense is better, maybe he wins that game. 7 innings, 4 runs. Is it a great start? No. Is it enough to keep a team around? Depending what the kind of night it is, maybe. But yeah, Verlander has to be better than that. And my assumption is, based on who he is and the name, that he will be. But he's got to prove that still, just like Tim was saying with Scherzer this year.
Yeah, well, we do have our very first fan question from Twitter. Irish Romanista asks, any theories on why the Mets pitchers are giving up so many home runs? Tim?
I think it's just part and parcel of them not pitching well. It goes into everything. They're walking guys too. They're mislocating their pitches. It's a lot of times fans don't like to hear that it's basic lack of execution. It's not, it's not necessarily they're throwing the wrong pitch. It's that Max Scherzer is hanging those sliders more this year than he did last year. His mechanics are not exactly where they need to be to execute the pitch properly. And we've seen a lot of those home runs given up by kind of that back part of the bullpen, the guys who are pitching in the 5th, 6th, and 7th inning. And one of the, we talked about it enough that I don't think it was overlooked last year, but the job that those relievers did for the Mets last year, especially Trevor Williams most prominently, that kept them in a lot of games, that ate up a lot of innings, that helped ease the load on the bullpen. Those guys in particular have struggled this year. We saw it yesterday with Dominic Leone giving up a pair of 2-run homers. So that's been kind of the underbelly of the bullpen that other teams have been able to get to either take control of a game or put it away. And those guys have given up a lot of long balls.
Well, as for the Mets starting pitching option, so Jose Quintana seems to be progressing well in his rehab. Meanwhile, McGill has not found consistent success at the big league level. But do you think that maybe the Mets should be taking another look at someone that's in AAA, maybe like Joey Lucchessi, Dave?
Yeah, I think you're going to see that pretty soon, actually, if Tyler McGill continues to go down that road. And I think Tyler McGill knows it too. Again, he's pitching to an ERA over 5, which is pretty bad. And, we've seen some backsliding here, with Tyler McGill and David Peterson, 2 guys that we thought were really going to be, continue to be breakthrough performers this year based on what they showed the Mets last year. McGill obviously got hurt for a long stretch last year, but it's just a lack of confidence. You spoke before about the home runs, and Tim had touched on that with the effect. McGill right now just isn't pitching with confidence. He doesn't have confidence in his fastball. And when you don't have that conviction and you don't have that belief in your pitchers and you don't have the belief in what you throw is going to work, then that just snowballs. And I think that's where you're seeing McGill right now. And I think that's why you eventually have to change things up, because a guy in his situation, I don't know if you're going to fix that up here. I don't know if you're going to find that confidence again and the ability to trust your pitches again until you go down, show that they can work in the minor leagues, and then come up again when you have that confidence back. It happens all the time. We're not talking with a guy like McGill. He doesn't have a long track record up here of success. So, there are guys that come up here and continue to be great for the continuation of the careers. There are other guys that wind up having to come up and go down a few times, before they find it. So I think they are going to have to make a switch here with McGill. I think the way McGill talked after yesterday's game was pretty telling, that he kind of feels that way too. So I wouldn't be surprised. Lucchesi deserves another shot. He's pitched with some length down there in AAA. Again, it's AAA, but it is what it is. I think he has a 2.5 ERA down there as well. So I think he certainly pitched his way and deserving of the shot.
And if that does happen for McGill, it's not the worst thing in the world for him either to be able to go down there, figure it out without the pressure of having to, be a big league starter for a team that's struggling. So let's stick with the bullpen. They have gotten a lot of work this season given the issues with the starting pitching. So with that, let's do some one word and why bullpen edition. So I am going to name one of the guys in the bullpen, and you'll give me one word and why how they've filled the gaps. So we'll start with Tim. John Curtis.
Okay. I think with a lot of these guys, the issue is, none of these guys are really terrible. I think you see a lot of ERAs between like 4 and 4.5 for the guys who are pitching in the middle innings. But a lot of times they're being asked to get big outs sometimes in the 7th inning or later. Curtis is a guy who showed some real promise when he was in Tampa a couple of years back. He was a key piece to a pennant-winning bullpen. He's not all the way back there from Tommy John surgery, but is a guy who I think, longer term, there's a couple people in this bullpen who you don't expect to be around for maybe the whole season or into next year. I think Curtis is a guy who maybe you're thinking longer term could be a piece for you, alongside like Drew Smith moving forward.
Okay, Dave, Dominic Leone.
Well, I was going to give him a much better word than I was thinking of based on the previous month that he had. But yesterday, I think the best thing you can say is erratic. I mean, just because of the month that he had leading up to yesterday's performance was pretty good. I mean, he had become kind of a trustworthy reliever to some degree, even though I would hardly qualify him as a household name there. So I think what happened yesterday can happen to a reliever. So I expected it to happen more often with him rather than the guy that was pitching to, I think to a 1.5 ERA the previous month on that and worked his way into the, circle of trust to some degree. So listen, I think when you're not talking about the guys that on the back three of the rotation here, it's going to be a bit of a grab bag with this group. Some nights you may get lucky and get a clean inning. Some nights they may have nothing and you may get pounded. So I think it's kind of a toss up. Leone had worked himself onto the positive side of the ledger. Yesterday kind of moves him back down a notch into, wondering who he is again.
Another guy that's made it into the circle of trust, Jeff Brigham. Tim, one word and why?
I think intriguing because the ERA I think is right around 4. The peripheral numbers suggest it could be a little bit better than that. The WHIP is below 1, so he's not allowing a lot of people to reach base. The problem is most of the guys who do reach base have scored against him, and you generally hope that evens out over time. He's got. I remember talking to him in spring, and he was lockering next to Adam Ottavino, and he said like that's what I want to be, is that kind of fastball slider guy. He's got interesting action on his pitches. It's just a matter of commanding them more consistently. He gets into trouble when he starts walking some guys, but I think he's out of the bullpen guys that they signed in the offseason, they brought in on minor league contracts or made deals for, like Brigham. He's probably the one that stood out the most and makes you think he could be a guy that helps them during this season. Dave,
what about Brooks Raley?
I would say stable. This guy was brought in to certainly was considered, a big get this offseason and had pitched well. His numbers are good. And he's, the rare commodity for them being a lefty in the pen. So that's been a help, but yeah, I think for the most part, he's been good, aside from that steal of home was something that he had to wear a little bit, which is, clearly that's humiliating for a pitcher when something like that happens. It's such a rare thing, and he falls prey to that, having his back to the runner in those situations, being a lefty. So I think that was a bad moment for him. But otherwise, I thought he had been fairly reliable for them. So they need him. They need him to be even better than he has been. That's what he was counting on when he was brought over here, especially with the way the rest of the bullpen has been.
Okay, Tim. Last but not least, Grant Hartwig.
2024, does that count as a word? Because I think that's when you're going to see him be more of a factor for them. I think right now he's kind of on that shuttle between Syracuse and Queens, and he's going to get into games like yesterday where he's just kind of in the middle innings trying to eat up some innings for them. Another guy who's intriguing with his lower slot, with what they've done with his slider, could be a real developmental win for him. He was an undrafted guy out of Miami of Ohio, was not even considering playing professional baseball at the time the Mets gave him a call. So you hope, if they're able to build a good, reliable late game reliever in Grant Hartwig, that speaks really well to the Mets developmental process. So he could be kind of a signifier there, but I don't expect him to be a guy who's getting critical outs for the 2023 Mets just yet.
So we have another fan comment from Eric Weinstein on Facebook. I can tell he is struggling with all of this. It says, time to sell. To win 90 games, we have to go something like 56-32 and no postseason this year. Sell Scherzer, Pham for starters. Tim, do you think the Mets will become sellers at the deadline? Is there a world in which that happens?
It depends on how you define sell. I think a lot of people, when they think sell, they think tank, basically. That's trading anyone who's a veteran. This team has a lot of them. That's probably moving Scherzer and Verlander. Might even be contemplating moving Alonso. I don't see the Mets going down that road. I think, limited sellers where they're trading some pieces that are on expiring contracts, like Tommy Pham or like David Robertson would probably be the one that gets the most at the trade deadline. That's a possibility if they're totally out of it at the deadline. But you've got to think like they've invested so much in this team. That Buck Showalter's only got a year left on his contract after this. Billy Epler, wants to make a solid impression as rumors about David Stearns have swirled for 4 straight years or whatever it is. They're invested a lot in this specific team having success. That makes it harder to sell than if, all of these guys had great job security.
Well, Dave, it's also a good point to bring up. Hannah Kaiser actually brought this up the other day on Baseball Night in New York. She said, with the expanded playoffs, it's a lot easier to make the playoffs. So it's a lot harder for teams to sell their players. Do you think the Mets could become that?
Well, I mean, that's a good point that Hannah made. And I think I just looked at a stat the other day. I think you have maybe 23 of the 30 teams within like 5.5 games of a playoff spot. So that's why you don't see a lot of movement earlier before the trade line. That's like people wait right until August 1st, and to push the button on something like that. As far as fans wanting their team to be a seller, it's because they want to get rid of all the guys they don't want to look at anymore. It's not even like for a baseball smarts reason for it. They're like, you know what? I'm sick of looking at these guys. I want to get rid of, Scherzer or Verlander or, you name it, Vogelbach, whoever. But I don't see that. Like Tim said, I mean, there's way too much invested in this team. And Steve Cohen, though he is in the investment business and that involves some trading and selling, buying and selling, I should say, I don't see him, doing that to this team. And again, a lot of the pieces are very high priced, underperforming players. You don't really find markets for that at the deadline. I mean, the deadline is a time to find a lot of bullpen help and maybe a good bat to get you through, which the Mets took a lot of criticism for not finding at the deadline last year. But no, that would surprise me if we saw any type of major pieces from this team being dealt. I just think that they want to forge ahead. I think they'll look to improve the team at the deadline. And I don't think, as much as they faded recently, and the numbers aren't good, being 14 out and 6.5 out of the wild card. But
they'll see it through.
Well, it just selling at the deadline and saying the season's over. That'd be a really, really tough thing to do, I think, for Steve Cohen at this point.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen either. But one thing that has happened since our last off day is Mark Vientos getting sent down. He had very minimal opportunity at the big league level. Pete Alonso comes back from the injured list. In 16 games since May 17th, Mark Vientos hit 178. So, Tim, how would you evaluate his time in the major leagues?
This is an incomplete grade, right? Like, he just didn't get the chance to show what he could do at this level. Like Francisco Alvarez struggled to a similar extent in his first couple weeks in the big leagues this year. And Vientos had such inconsistent playing time that it was hard for him to find any kind of offensive rhythm. I think fans have been perplexed. I think reporters have been perplexed by how the Mets have handled him, really dating back to last season when they didn't call him up initially in September. So it's been kind of he hasn't gotten really the proper chance to show what he can do at this level yet to have a real evaluation of him, considering all that he's done at the AAA level the last few years.
Yeah, it really has been such a mystery the way it's all been handled. It's almost like there's something we don't know or something just based on the whole thing is odd. But Dave, do you think that he gets another shot at the bigs at some point this year? And for the Mets, we'll say.
I mean, it killed me. And again, I wasn't there that day. But when they optioned him out, when Alonso was activated, and Buck Showalter said, yeah, he really needs to get some at-bats. And I'm like, oh, really? I mean, you had the chance, to give him plenty of at-bats right here in Flushing, and you decided not to. So just a huge head-scratcher for me. Call him up, guys raking in AAA. Call him up, plays that first day, hits a home run. And then you basically ice him. Then he doesn't play and then doesn't get back in the lineup until he cools off. I mean, it was really mind-boggling, and the other part of that, when he did play towards the end before they sent him down, I was looking, he played so sporadically. I think 3 of the 4 games he played, he started against Spencer Strider, Garrett Cole, and Mitch Keller. And it's like, you're giving Vogelbach a week off to get right on the active roster, doing everything you can to get him right. But for Vientos, you're giving him his limited playing time against 3 of the top pitchers in the sport right now.
Yeah.
I just don't think there's any part of it that was handled correctly. I don't know why. Like you mentioned, maybe there's some kind of personal thing there. I don't know.
It was weird.
Otherwise, it's tough to explain.
Yeah, it was weird too, because when Pete was out, you thought maybe he was going to get some more reps at first than he did. Right. And it just, the whole thing was odd. But again, not our decisions to make. So looking ahead, the Mets have a 3-game set in Philly this weekend, followed by a 7-game homestand against the Brewers and the Giants. So Tim, who is your X factor this weekend against Philly?
Against Philly, it's Carlos Carrasco. This is a guy who has, as much as we've talked about the starting rotation, we haven't focused a lot on his struggles as well. And a guy who, look, last year was not a great season for Carlos Carrasco, but it was a serviceable one where he kept the team in the game more times than not. And he has not been able to do that this year. So they need him. We've talked about McGill maybe going down and Lucchessi coming up. That doesn't solve this spot in the rotation with Carrasco. He's another guy who really needs to start pitching better, especially before Quintana comes back, to try to get this starting rotation on a roll.
Dave, who's your X factor?
I mean, I'd like to see kind of the real Jeff McNeil stand up at some point, right? I mean, that even rhymes. I didn't really think about that part.
Slim Shady reference.
Guys, where's this kind of slashing guy and, driving balls into the gaps and really kind of hitting the ball with authority? I mean, when we see him, it's a lot of these flares to the opposite field. And again, hitting way below, average wise for what you want to count that as. He's a, bat to ball guy. And I just we really haven't seen that guy at all this year. The Mets really kind of need him to break out, and, no better time than the present, go down to a hitter's park and see what he can do down there. I know he's frustrated, it certainly shows his emotions pretty clearly when he's out there. So, I think the Mets have a number of guys that kind of need to step up in a lot of different areas, but I think it'd be good to see McNeil, get right and kind of, activate this offense like he's able to do and like he did last year.
Yeah, both great answers. Tim, how do you plan to spend the rest of your off day?
I am trying to reconfigure and put together a playroom for my son. So any DIY tips anyone has, let's keep it to a beginner level, please. Would be appreciated.
Dad of the year, Dave. What about you? Yeah, that's some big shoes to fill. So I hope you got something good.
It's I'm headed up to the Bronx to cover the other team in town tonight, weather permitting. So we'll see how they manage to do with their upset fans at this point of the year. They are on a 2-game winning streak though, so we'll see how it pans out tonight.
Huge,
yeah, right. Exactly.
All right, Dave and Tim, thank you so much. And guys, thanks for watching this latest edition of Mets Off Day Live. We'll be back with another episode on Thursday, July 13th, right after the All-Star break at 12 p.m. So Tim and Dave,